attention. And I do think every hour of what we have to go counts a great deal. This is inclusive growth. So when we think about where our future is headed and what it means, this panel is about inclusive growth. Please join me in welcoming Nikki Evans, Executive Director of the Jeremiah Project, Brooklyn, Christian González-Rivera, the Director of Strategic Policy Initiatives at the Brookdale Center for Healthy Aging at Hunter College, CUNY, Yahshaanyah Hill, Senior Vice President of Workforce Opportunity Investments at the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone Development Corporation, Daphany Sanchez, Executive Director of Kinetic Communities Consulting, and Mirtha Santana, housing advocate and housing advocate. They are in conversation with Angelique Molina-Mangaroo of New York Nonprofit Media. The floor is yours. Have fun. Thank you. Oh, round of applause, please.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. So I'm excited to get this panel started. So, panelists, tell me about inclusive growth. What does it mean to you? How does inclusive growth strategy differ from current economic development model? And feel free to include any examples you have on hand. We can start this way.
Okay. So inclusive growth, I think that the word kind of says it, is that no one is left behind. The communities that have been, especially communities that have been marginalized and have been left behind through the years in this city, are included in the development of the city. That's sweet and short answer. I'll pass it to Daphne.
Thank you. Exactly that, to add on, like ensuring intentional reinvestment in historically disinvested Black and Brown communities, and to make sure that the future is a clean, healthy, and sustainable one.
We'll talk. So inclusive growth to me is on a personal level. It really means creating systems change on a local level to make sure that we are empowering and recognizing the creative assets of community organizations so that they can help to kind of set and inform local economic development policy.
So hi, everybody. So of course, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to you. I mean, since I work at a place called the Brookdale Center for Healthy Aging, that, I mean, in my case, to me, inclusivity also means making sure that people of all ages are included in the future workforce. You know, in the early 90s, about 12% of workers were over the age of 50. Today, it's 1 in 4 people. It's 25%. So certainly, I mean, it's like, you know, there's that need to include various generations in the workplace because there are more people who want to and need to work longer. But at the same time, the other piece of that is including the future you, because if all goes well, the future us, I mean, it's like, because if all goes well, we're going to be older workers too. And so a lot of the ideas that we think about here, whether it's career pathways throughout the length of your life, whether it's education, not just at the beginning, but in different pieces of your life, all of those different pieces that we talk about as a workforce community are essential for a workforce that's going to be a lot more intergenerational, where you're not just expected to learn everything when you're young, work in the middle of your life, and then just retire. A more dynamic work life is going to involve more dynamic connections with learning, skill building, and reconnecting to jobs. So age inclusivity.
And for me, inclusive growth is also thinking about what are the unique challenges and barriers that keep people from fully participating in the growth of our economy, because we have many people who are participating. They're going to work every day. They are, you know, being active citizens in their day-to-day life, but they're not necessarily fully participating. They're not gaining access to quality jobs. They are not clear in the pathways that are in front of them. They have unique challenges, you know, parents, single parents, even dual income households have unique challenges that we don't talk about and that we have long not fully discussed when we talk about inclusive growth, because inclusivity is also about families. It's also about recognizing that we have a vested interest in, like, not just the parents, but the children as well, and that there is a dynamic piece to that. You know, I think we have gotten to the point where looking at it from a very siloed perspective is no longer okay, because people are living very dynamic lives, and we as the workforce system have to respond to that.
Thank you, Nikki. The mayor's plan for economic development came out last March. The blueprint includes driving inclusive sector growth and a pillar about connecting New Yorkers to quality jobs and in-demand skills. It essentially promotes many of the recommendations and strategies laid out in the blueprint. How can city leadership and the Adams administration proactively work to implement inclusive growth strategies? And we can start with Nikki and then go back down.
So I think one of the first things, if we're talking about how we can start to include these strategies, is one, be clear about what our system is now. I think we have a lot of competition within the system. I think we have a lot of gaps and holes. Like, I'm so excited to hear Google say that they were investing in NYECTC simply to look at least the gaps within tech education and tech training. But there's a lot of gaps in our system. There's a lot of competitiveness in our system. And I think that we have to really start recognizing that there's no one solution, that oftentimes it takes multiple programs to make someone fully ready to move on to a quality path job or to move on to a tech job. It's not a 6-week coding class. And so understanding what our system already has and how do we encourage collaboration, how do we support it, how does funding and policy support it, because it's going to take many hands to lift this ship.
Yeah, I like the idea or I forgot how exactly it was worded in the mayor's economic development blueprint, but it was something along the lines of making sure that the workforce system isn't just a system built for the poor. It's something that's built for everyone. And I like that idea because the fact is, I mean, it's like we have so many programs in New York City, in fact, more than anywhere else, which makes sense. We're the biggest city. But then we also have, the City University of New York, I mean, which is an extremely important resource. And so the fact of the matter is, I mean, as we were talking about before, a life that is in which you're working longer, in which the skill needs for any particular job are constantly changing, is also a life where you're going to continue to have to learn at different points in your life. You're not going to get a bachelor's degree every 10 years. You're going to most probably take short-term programs at some point to re-up your skills. And this is something that, I mean, it's like when you put it together that way, it makes a lot of sense altogether, but it's something that still is not how do you say this in English? No compagina bien. It doesn't
Integrate or
some of you know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's like it doesn't fit well with a system that is still very much designed to go to school when you're younger, work in the middle of your life, and then retire. And so that's something that needs to change. I mean, it's like, and we've been talking about it for such a long time, and I feel like once again I'm talking about the same thing. I mean, as are many of you, but I think that this is a clearer time than ever to realize that we really need to learn across the life course. And so it's encouraging to me that at least this is recognized in the language in the economic development report.
So coming from an economic development standpoint, I know that we spent a lot of time really making recommendations towards workforce development and economic development. And the one thing that we wanted to make sure was that we weave the two together and make sure that we promote the fact that workforce development is as much an economic policy as it is a social policy. So happy to see that the mayor's office has really adopted our recommendation around reinvigorating the mayor's office of workforce development. So we commend the mayor's office on that. Also happy to see that the focus is on economic development and workforce development. And what I would love to see more of and love to see change is more focus on that in terms of making sure that when we have local economic development in the community, that there is workforce development that is weaved into that, and that the mayor's office can take an intermediary approach to make sure that there's accountability around that, to make sure that it is actually happening, and that we're not looking at economic development just as job growth, but making sure that there are quality wages tied into, weaved into a lot of these initiatives.
There's so many components to economic development that intertwine with climate and resiliency. And for me, on the climate perspective, you'll hear people talk a lot about, well, what's happening in 2050? What's happening in 2030? And for those of you that know me, I'm always like, F that. Like, there's bodies right now dying, and there's people that are getting asthma attacks. There's people that are living in crappy positions. They're living in mold. They're living in lead. They're living with asbestos. So for me, when we talk about economic development and inclusive engagement with communities and with New Yorkers, is ensuring that any climate solution, any economic development solution, any renewables that are being developed, forget about large scale and really think about the hyper local, really think about the existing ecosystem within these communities, really think about the existing ecosystem of small businesses, of MWPEs, of schools, really connect the dots between workforce development, between education, between renewables, because if we don't have a pathway forward, we're just going to continue to exacerbate the issue of Black and brown bodies dying every day today. So it's very important to intertwine all of the components together for a clean energy future.
Okay, so I'm going to continue intertwining as as you're talking about economic development and workforce development. All I'm thinking about is housing. So if we think about a minimum wage worker, a home attendant, for example, earning $15 an hour, that worker working 40 hours a week cannot pay the rent unless it's subsidized, unless they have city FEBs, they have Section 8, they live in public housing, somebody's doing a favor for them. The bottom line is that we need a home. We are not, human beings are not working machines. We are human beings with families. We need quality childcare so that mothers, fathers, parents feel comfortable leaving their children and going to work. So there are, when I saw the report and I am reading about the jobs of the future and also welcoming visitors back to New York. We all love our tourists. They bring a lot of money to this city, but many of those jobs are service jobs that do not pay enough money for people to live a quality lifestyle.
Thank you. You all touched on this already, but I want to go a little deeper. Yahshaanyah, how can housing and economic development weave together with workforce development towards an equitable recovery?
So I think in terms of housing, I think with workforce development, we have to understand that workforce development or job training is not just a poverty focus, right? It's not going to just promote economic mobility on its own. We need affordable housing. We need healthcare. We need mental health. We need a holistic approach to making sure that, you know, workforce development can be beneficial and can promote upward mobility. And what good is it for you to have a job and not have a living wage and you can't pay your rent? So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you. Mirtha?
I think I said it already. And Yahshaanyah said it already. It's a minimum wage, 40 hours a week cannot pay the rent of a one-bedroom apartment in the city. It's just that, it's that simple.
And it's so important, upward mobility, right? Because I think many times when people talk about economic development, they're like, oh, you know, Black and brown bodies can be service jobs. And in the renewable sector, they can just do the solar panels installations. But we're more than just our bodies. Like, we're more than just physical labor. And the city really needs to think about, what does that upward mobility looks like? What are the artificial barriers that are presented that prohibit Black and brown bodies to get these higher paying wages? And what are some other infrastructures, whether it's policy or just, quite frankly, structural racist practices that prohibit people to move from that service job into another type of job? So it's important when we talk about housing, understanding that interconnection of upward mobility and economic development, whether it's in climate or in other sectors, to be front and center in every conversation.
And also, I just want to add that I think that also raises the question too about our silent approach with dealing with populations, because a single person, you know, making $15 an hour is not going to be able to afford a home or an apartment in the city. And so oftentimes we kind of think about it as like, oh, if I help the youth, that's going to end poverty. If I help the adults, that's going to end poverty. The fact of the matter is, the youth who's in your program and the adult who's in your program are probably in the same household. And they are probably trying to work together to keep their heads above water. And so oftentimes when we use the silent approach, we keep forgetting the life that these people are living. They have parents. I come from a lower income family. If my mother needs something, my disposable income is going to pay for that because she needs it. And the same thing for parents. If your child needs something, no matter how much more money you're going to earn, you're going to take care of that. And so I think a lot of our workforce thinking is like, oh, if we just help this one population, if we just do this one thing here, then it'll fix it. But we have to start realizing that this really is about a lot of interplay between generations and communities and families. And so we have to take a longer term look at it. We have to build a more comprehensive system, to Christian's point, that allows people to move along a pathway at different stages of their life. And we have to recognize that. And right now we don't, because we are so geared because of the way funding and financing works in nonprofit to only think about, special populations and special groups. One group is not going to solve the problems that we have, especially coming out of COVID.
Well, now that you mentioned that, Nikki, do you mind if I jump in as well? Or, I mean, I know we have like,
Go ahead.
I wanted to just throw in really quickly. I mean, it's like in terms of help across the generations. One thing well, now I think because of COVID, it's a lot more recognized. But the fact is that there are a lot of people who are taking off of work or working fewer hours because of caregiving. And so, of course, I mean, it's like they put their own livelihoods and their own housing, et cetera, at risk because, I mean, it's like they're working less hours, to fulfill those caregiving roles. And on top of that, of course, I mean, very often, almost all of the people who do this, not exclusively, but almost all, are women. So when we're talking about the gender pay gap, I mean, it's like another issue. In part, it's because, yes, I mean, it's like you have women who step out of paid work in order to do other kinds of essential yet unpaid work. So, I mean, that means on the policy level, I mean, there needs to be more support for caregivers, and there needs to be really benefits need to be rethought as well about, I mean, it's like, what do you do for someone? I mean, it's like who might be able to receive a benefit because they're older, but then their caregiver is not old enough to receive that benefit. I mean, it's like, so they fall in between the benefit cracks. So there's a lot of rethinking that needs to be done along those lines, as more people are either people who are cared for or people who need care, who are cared for or are giving care. So.
Can I just add
One
one
last
thing?
comment.
Piggybacking off of Christian talking about the caregivers, I think we also need to be proponents of the nonprofit community-based workforce development organizations that are in these communities, trying to help promote economic mobility and making sure that they have the capacity and the funding and the resources to be able to help individuals that are in need. And I think that's something far too often we don't keep in the conversation.
All right, y'all. Well, we are at time. Thank you so much to everyone who came to the panel. Thank you, panelists. It was an interesting conversation. Good job, y'all.
I was so hijacked that conversation with that girl. Wow.
Nikki.